Hey, welcome to Temp Check with Geoff. Today is August 22nd, and I want to talk to you about narrative frames. So, I've recently coalesced around this idea that in contemporary society today, in the West, there are effectively three different paths via which one can live a life, like a real life, a full life, over the next 10 years. It's always hard to make predictions beyond a 10-year time horizon, but I think this is going to remain generally true over the next 10 years. Path one is to basically remain or to make oneself digitally disengaged. Now, this means like very limited engagement online, aside from perhaps like using email occasionally, some e-commerce ordering. You might occasionally use the search tool, but like no social media engagement, almost no online footprint. And there's a lot to be said. There's a lot to be said for being digitally disengaged, because you basically can exist wholly outside of these popular narratives that form on the most used digital platforms. Now, I would imagine that within digitally engaged, there's going to be somewhat of a barbell distribution where something close to the majority, or maybe a super majority of folks who are digitally disengaged over the next 10 years will skew somewhat lower income. But then there is going to be this subset of like the top 1 or 0.1% of society that actually is digitally disengaged. And if you can actually build a business and build a life with a digitally disengaged online footprint, there's a lot to recommend it. There's a lot to be said for it. You're off the radar. You can sort of have sort of there's more degrees of freedom to live. Um, Unfortunately, I have not pursued the digital disengaged strategy, nor have you, because definitionally, you found me here on Twitter. You're watching this video via Twitter or YouTube. I am not digitally disengaged, nor are you, because you're watching this video. And so we fall into a different category. And basically, amongst the digitally engaged, I think there are again two paths. So path one is digitally disengaged. That's a very interesting path that I think is quite underexplored. Path two is digitally engaged pseudonym. So using a pseudonym, an airtight pseudonym, where your real identity is masked, you engage digitally, and you exist in the real world as well. And you sort of have degrees of freedom to sort of build a life and have family and have friends, and you sort of your identity is not revealed online. And again, this is a very interesting path. It's too late for me to do the pseudonym thing. So I'm digitally engaged on path number three, which is probably the overwhelming majority of my audience is in the same boat as me, which is we are digitally engaged, real identity. We use our real identities online. We live, hopefully most of us, we live offline, have real lives that are not just our Twitter feeds, but certainly online, our real identities are there. And the challenge with being, the risk with this, I mean, there's a lot of great things about it, but the risk with it is always that somehow you can get run over by a narrative freight train when you're digitally engaged and live partially online. And um, and so and so in practice, what the very the extremely powerful folks who are digitally engaged and are sort of keyed into the power of narrative, what they would tend to do is to craft these elaborate narratives to avoid getting framed by a popular narrative. And so a modal example would be someone like Warren Buffett, who obviously is one of the richest people alive. He sort of created the Giving Pledge. There's tons of pictures online of his very quaint house in Omaha, and he's sort of this billionaire, everyday Joe billionaire who's very lovable and wants to give away all his money. That is a counter narrative to defensively and actually offensively protect him against sort of a narrative of being an evil billionaire. It's worked phenomenally well, and I would imagine it takes like a full team of full-time people working to craft that narrative for Buffett. You can't really blame him because he's trying to protect himself from getting run over by a popular narrative. So in literature, narrative in literature, this idea of narrative frames is basically this concept of there's sort of a dominant narrative in a story, and the majority of the story is focused on this dominant narrative. That's the frame, and the dominant narrative is a setup for this smaller narrative, this that's sort of less focused on, but actually ends up being the conclusion of the sort of all of the meaning ends up, or a lot of the meaning ends up being in the smaller narrative that was set up by the dominant narrative. And in contemporary literary fiction, I think my favorite use of narrative frame comes from Michel Houellebecq in his work in French. It's let's see, my French is not very good, even though I'm from Canada. It's les particules élémentaires, and the English translation was renamed as atomized. So Atomized tells the story of two brothers, Bruno and Michel, eponymous with the author. Bruno and Michel. Bruno is just effectively, he's a sex addict. So Bruno's a sex addict, and Michel is a scientist. And the dominant narrative, the narrative frame in this story is all about just it's an indictment of contemporary society as told through the intersecting lives of these two brothers over sort of many decades. And you think that's where the story ends. You think it's just this really interesting indictment of contemporary society. But then there's a surprise. In the last sort of few pages of the book, it's revealed that Michel is not just any ordinary scientist. He actually invented human cloning, which resulted in the end of conception via humans populating, and the humanity effectively ends because everyone just gets cloned. And the implication is that basically he destroys humanity through this dystopic technological biological innovation that Michel pioneered. So it paints a very dystopic vision of technology, and he very effectively uses the narrative frame technique to do so. Which brings me to the final point, which is in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley has a major narrative frame problem, folks. Um, basically, the basic narrative over preceding decades of technological innovation with Silicon Valley was that technology was the way, was the singular way to make the world a better place. And this was like sort of sold wholesale, bought part and parcel by the narrative gatekeepers. It was propagated by the narrative gatekeepers. Silicon Valley technologists aren't very good at storytelling. They're not very good at narrative generally. There are a few exceptions to this, but generally not very good at it. And ultimately, Silicon Valley let itself get framed by this narrative that was very convenient to be told by narrative gatekeepers that like Silicon Valley was the thing making the world a better place. And it turns out that like most popular narratives, that narrative was and is partially true. Like there are some technologies that are good that make the world a better place. There are also some technologies that are bad that can make the world a worse place. But unfortunately, the narrative frame was that technology is like wholly good, and the Silicon Valley people aren't very good at narrative, and so there's going to be a lot of there's going to be a lot of runaway narratives that run over companies and run over people in Silicon Valley, like a freight train, and it's going to get dicey. That's all for today. Think about narrative frame. Bye.